Hi, everybody. Happy Passover, Good Friday, all that. Want to talk today about the Gilded Age, which is also the period of Reconstruction, which has to do with the sort of reconstruction of the South. And the number's 091359. And I'm going to have to use Google Slides again. Okay, one of the things that's the Union wins the war. The Confederacy surrenders at Appomattox, and we have the question of how to reconstruct the southern states. How do we ensure that slavery is ended? How does representation take place after the war is over? And this is a crucial issue. Remember the Three-Fifths Compromise. When slavery existed in southern states, adult men over the age of 21 were counted, and then the number of representatives was calculated based on 3/5 of their number, and that increased the power of people who were enslavers or people who were in slave regions. Those counties that had lots of enslaved people in them had a great deal of representation, although only a few people voted. But the question is, what's going to happen with freed people? Are freed people going to be allowed to vote? What's going to happen with the land? All of this stuff is the question of Reconstruction, and there are three phases to Reconstruction, I think. The first is presidential Reconstruction. The second is the polarization that's associated with and the second is radical Reconstruction. Polarization is political polarization that leads to conflict. It's also called Congressional Reconstruction. That happens in 1867. And then 1868 to 1877 is what's called redemption. And that's a term that white Southern political elites use to describe this period. So we've got presidential Reconstruction, radical Reconstruction, and redemption. And I want to kind of step us through this. This is important to understand what's going to be the legacy of the end of slavery. How is it going to work? Who's going to benefit? So remember that the war starts when Abraham Lincoln is elected. And it's the election of Abraham Lincoln that leads South Carolina and then the Deep South states to secede. Just his election, just the fact that the Republican Party is in power. The other states in North Carolina, Virginia, places like that, Tennessee, North Carolina and Tennessee and Virginia, secede only after Lincoln calls for troops. So you've got, strangely, a party that was a third party, was a tiny party, becomes a majority party, and then has an important impact on the war. We talked a little bit impact on the nation, and the nation is radically changed by the war. So what's the ideology of the Republican Party? It's associated with growth of cities, international trade, with expansion to the West for people who are not enslaved. To fight this war, the Union issues greenbacks, a kind of fiat currency that the Union will eventually guarantee, but at the time is not backed by silver or gold. And a railroad expansion that takes place actually during the war itself. This is quite ironic. If you imagine the 1860s technology relies largely on stoop labor to build railroads, right? You have people who are lining and relining tracks. You have people who are laying tracks. This is stoop labor, and there's a lot of stoop labor in the war itself, right? Most soldiers, Union and Confederate, are fighting. Most men are fighting, and so what the Union does, what the Republican Party does, is bring large numbers of Chinese immigrants from the West. They bring Irish immigrants from the East, and they build the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroad. They start laying that track, blasting those tunnels during the war itself, even as there's a manpower shortage in farms throughout the country because of the war. So, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated right before the end of the war. He was replaced by Andrew Johnson, who is from Tennessee, and someone who had been a slaveholder, had supported the Union, but was himself a slaveholder, had used slaves to do construction work along railway corridors in Tennessee, and is not all that keen, is perfectly willing to accept the end of slavery, but is not keen on allowing black people to vote. Believes that black people are unfit to vote. He says that the biggest problem of the post-war period is amalgamation, is the basically black and white people having children together, biracial couples. To him, this is the most disturbing thing about the South. So Andrew Johnson is a very different person from Abraham Lincoln, but Andrew Johnson is president. Andrew Johnson wants to build his own political party out of the dregs of the Democratic and the Republican parties. Now, the Democratic Party has kind of, as you can imagine, shrunk in terms of its power in the North. And Johnson has this idea that he's going to get kind of anti-black Northerners, racist Northerners, and racist Southerners together in one party. He then creates what's called presidential reconstruction, which basically says the states can readmit themselves. All they have to do is meet and create new constitutions that outlaw slavery, and then apply to him, and they can become states again. Remember I talked about the Three-Fifths Compromise. What the southern states do is say, slavery's over, but black people can't vote. The white Southerners who come together to create these states say the states are going to reconstruct themselves, but white people are the only people who can vote. And so now black men no longer count as 3/5; they count as 5/5, right? They're counted in the regular population, but they can't vote. So this actually increases the power of white Southern Democrats in majority black counties. Does that make sense? The end of slavery potentially increases their political power. And so Georgia, for example, which only has white people in its constitutional convention to create the new party, it's established in 1865, sends Alexander Stephens, vice president of the Confederacy, as Georgia's senator into Congress. The fear is that Southern Democrats are going to come back, that their power is going to increase drastically, and the first thing they're going to do, what the House of Representatives is going to do when they sit, is for the Democrats to say, we would like to bring a resolution declaring that secession is legal and that the South is separated. Does that make sense? So that's the fear, is that basically their power is magnified by the end of slavery if black people can't vote. So this is an image of the Freedmen's Bureau. A Freedmen's Bureau is an organization that establishes itself during the war to deal with, it's called the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, BRFAL. And the Freedmen's Bureau acts as a sort of court, as a sort of local justice organization. Once from 1863 up until 1865, the Southern courts are not really functioning at this point, and the Union Army sends mostly disabled Union veterans into the South to try to kind of reestablish control in these regions to prevent, as you can imagine, there are a lot of ex-soldiers who are kind of rampaging around with guns, assaulting people. This is former Confederate soldiers who are getting revenge against their officers in some cases. There is quite a bit of violence, particularly in the hills. But Congress pushes back. And Congress says, under Thaddeus Stevens and others, say, the president can't do this. The president can't declare these states to be just reconstructed, in which only white people can vote. And this is a quote from Thaddeus Stevens. The whole fabric of Southern society must be changed. How can Republican institutions, and by that he means like what we would call free institutions, free schools, free churches, free social intercourse exist in a mingled community of nabobs and serfs? By that he means very large landowners and poor white Southerners who do not own their own land, of the owners of 20,000-acre manors with lordly palaces, and the occupants of narrow huts inhabited by low white trash. As you can imagine, Thaddeus Stevens is not that keen on poor white Southerners. His point in this is to say that poor white Southerners are simply going to follow along the lead of these large landowners. And we go back here and think about agriculture in the South, and I'm always keen to think about agriculture. Most of the food that's being produced in the South is being produced by poor white Southerners, like the man here in the center. Why do we know he's a poor white Southerner? First of all, his haircut. It's kind of shaggy there in the back. He's, what else can we say about him? He's not wearing a long coat. He's wearing a short jacket. He's kind of stooped over here. This is a poor white Southerner. We know that the man in the man of leisure is a planter, and planters are not producing that much food. They're mostly producing the staple goods that are being exported from the South, cotton above all, but also tobacco and rice. And they're not producing it. It is the people in the background here, the black men and women in the background who had previously been owned by planters like this. Other things that let us know as a planter: the riding boots, the closely cropped pants, what else do we see here? The hat, that's called a planter hat, with that wide brim that protects his face, the long hair in the back, and particularly the long-tailed coat. All of those show us that this is a planter. And these people want to return to some sort of plantation society, want to start producing cotton again, accept that slavery is over, but see themselves as kind of natural authorities. And on the right is the freedmen's. So the circle that you can just barely see there identifies who can vote in Andrew Johnson's plan of Reconstruction, which is basically poor white and white Southerners. Some states, like Virginia, had property qualifications for white voters. That goes away after the war, but it's still only white people that are voting. And the something like 40 to 50%, depending on the state, of black people cannot vote in that system. And so how does Congress do anything against this guy, the president? Well, Congress looks to the Constitution, and it says in the Constitution that Congress has the right to ensure a Republican form of government in the states. To ensure a Republican form of government. And probably the reason for this was to make sure that New Jersey doesn't, in the 1770s, doesn't try to create a king. Because New Jersey would totally do that, right? And so the fear is that monarchical institutions might emerge in the southern states, and so Congress has the right to ensure a Republican form of government. So that is, it has some control over the states in that it can't, it has to ensure that a republic exists in those states rather than a monarchy or something like that. But what the Congress says is that this is not Republican, right? You can see it in Thaddeus Stevens' speech there. that this is not Republican if there are all these people in this community who can't vote. If voting is restricted to just a tiny number of people, then that's not a Republican form of government. And so, Congress refuses to let southern states sit in Congress. A congressman can't just come into Congress if they're elected by the state. They have to be introduced on the floor by someone else in Congress before they can be seated, the House or the Senate. And that basically Congress declares that southern states will not be seated, even though they've sent their representative, even though Alexander Stephens has arrived, waiting to sit in his Senate seat and prepared to declare secession legal, possibly. They don't seat them. And Congress declares that these states in the Reconstruction Acts are territories, just like Kansas, just like any territory that's not yet a state. It has a governor. That governor is appointed by Congress, and they'll come from the military. And let me just make sure there's no questions. Oh, there is a question. Why was the white man on the right not able to fight in Johnson's? So the white man on the right is not able to vote in Johnson's Reconstruction plan because he's actually not a citizen of the state. He's a representative from the Freedmen's Bureau and is just down there to sort of introduce free people. Yeah. So that's why he can't vote. And so white Southerners only can vote in the elections. All right. So Congress refuses to seat them. They declare the states to be territories or districts, and some districts like Georgia and South Carolina are bound up together in one district. And governors are appointed to operate them, and those are military governors. And they have to create constitutions, but they have to let other people vote. And I don't have a good image for the other people voting. So 1865 was Johnson's year to reconstruct. 1866 is Congress's year to reconstruct. And they basically decide to revolt against the president. So partly this is a conflict between the Republican Party and Johnson, and partly this is a conflict between Congress and the presidency about who gets to reconstruct. And what they say is that there's all this violence in the South, right? That the massacre of the innocents at New Orleans, this famous image from Thomas Nast, shows basically a riot against black men in New Orleans in which over a dozen black men, women, and children are killed in a riot. There's a similar riot in Memphis, and there's just chaos in this region. As you can see, there's U.S. Grant in the lower left, and this is obviously everybody's in Roman clothing. U.S. Grant is holding a knife. Is that right? The dagger. No. It's who is that with Grant? That's his Assistant Secretary of War. And Grant is being handed a dagger, being told to assassinate this Caesar who is causing these problems. So Congressional Reconstruction is also called Radical Reconstruction, and it is radical because Congress basically eliminates southern states and makes them recreate themselves. What's also interesting about it is they create these things called the Black and Tan Conventions. That's what other people call them. And they basically, the governors say there will be elections, there will be new constitutions that will be drawn up by the southern states, and you will have to allow black people and non-property holders and others to vote. Tan is a reference to the people who work in their own fields, small farmers and things like that. They're called poor white trash is the term that Thaddeus Stevens refers to them, but a somewhat more polite term for them are the tans, the people who are working in their own field and therefore don't have a planter hat and aren't pasty white. Okay, so the Black and Tan Conventions create new state constitutions, and they radically reform southern states in ways that are mostly for the good. Another reason for the congressional reconstruction or radical reconstruction is that southern states in 1865, when there were just white people in the conventions, basically made it a crime to be a black man who was outside of the place where he came from. If he didn't have a pass and he was in a city, he could be arrested and basically made to work. So they were called the Black Codes. There were a lot of other problems with the South besides the violence, besides the basically public whipping and chain gangs and things like that that are created immediately after the war. There's technically no slavery, but being a freed person, there are all sorts of limitations that are placed on them. Interracial marriage is illegal. All sorts of other black people are not allowed to attend educational institutions and all these sorts of things. So that's why congressional reconstruction happens, and that's Congress that does that. And part of this is an obvious reaction to having somebody like Johnson as president. If Lincoln had been president, it would have been probably a much more, coherent transition for Reconstruction. But what we have here is basically a battle between Congress and the president about what happens in the South. Now, we shouldn't see this as unique. The broadening of the franchise, it's called, the widening of the number of people who can vote, is also happening in Europe. As Germany is consolidating from Prussia and all these little municipalities into something that we call Prussia or Germany, it's broadening the franchise and allowing many more people to vote. Britain, in exactly the same period, in 1867, passes the Reform Act, which brings household suffrage to Britain. And so you no longer have just a few lords and their lackeys and things like that voting. You have anybody who has a household is allowed to vote in Britain after 1867. So this idea that states depend on a broad voting public is something that's happening elsewhere as well. It's not unique. It's not just about the end of slavery. It's also this idea that you shouldn't have a state in which people can't vote. Of course, this also raises the question of women, whether women should vote. And it's at this period that we see also a tremendous push for women's suffrage. If we're going to broaden the franchise, if we're going to allow non-property holders to vote, perhaps women should vote as well. And so there's some tension actually in the Republican Party between those who believe that it's just black people who should vote and others who believe that black people and women should vote. This will continue to be a burning issue for the next 25 years. And so this is how the South is divided up. I'm sorry. It's Georgia and Alabama are put together alongside Florida in one big district. And that's congressional reconstruction. That's radical reconstruction. All right. Now, the criticism of radical reconstruction by white Southerners is that it brings carpetbaggers into the South. Carpetbaggers are supposedly white Union veterans who come down. All they own is a carpet bag, so they just have one little piece of luggage. They own nothing. They persuade black people to vote for them, and they come to political power. There's not a lot of that, although there are many Union veterans who do come to the South and see the opportunities. They see cheap land, and they set up apple trees and buy large plots of land, some of them in the South, as this is happening. And so the opposition to this by Southern Democrats is kind of spun out into criticism of corruption in the South. And is there corruption in the South after the Civil War? Yes, there is. But it's not just the Republican Party that's involved in corruption. Are railroads, for example, coming into southern states and buying legislators to get control of the major railroads in the South? Absolutely. But they're buying Republican and Democratic legislators in this period. So there is corruption in this period. There are carpetbaggers, but the Democratic Party in the South kind of spins this story up into a kind of story of reckless crime that's traveling through the South because of congressional reconstruction. The people who are in particular behind this story of corruption, this sort of, I don't know, 1860s version of QAnon is the Klan. The Klan is an organization that claims that it will retake the power over southern states, that the states are corrupt, that they need to be purified, and that the only way to do this is with masked men, vigilantes, who will bring justice to the South. And what do? They attack black men who are political leaders. They attack white men who are political leaders and happen to be Republicans. They kill hundreds of them, possibly close to 1,000 people in South Carolina, for example, in between 1868 and 1872. This is the height of the Klan. They dress up in these robes, and it's. Could I repeat what carpetbaggers are? There's a question. So carpetbaggers, carpetbaggers is a kind of it's an offensive term to describe Union soldiers who have no money coming into the South to profit from the South's problems. So that's what a carpetbagger is. Another term that shows up a lot in the kind of Klan story of the South is scalawags. And scalawags are poor white Southerners who are motivated to come to political power by the decline of their betters, the elite. All right, so these Klan attacks, they attack prominently African Americans, particularly political leaders. They kill some, others they threaten. They threaten, we'll kill you and your family unless you come to the courthouse steps on court day and renounce your support for the Republican Party and say that you will from henceforth vote Democratic. And this is actually quite, it's somewhat effective. It leads, it kind of not only kills but also destabilizes a sort of black political organizations that are forming in the South by targeting these people. So this is, bear with me here. Okay, so this then circle is what happens in radical Reconstruction, is that we have almost universal suffrage, manhood suffrage, white and black Southerners voting. We have the black and tan conventions that create these state constitutions. And we have states change in important ways. All the states, for example, will allow black testimony in trials. Previously, that had been disallowed in many southern states. They allow black people to bring charges in court. They allow them to sit on juries. Their vote is protected. Black and white schools are created. This is what radical Reconstruction means. But from the perspective of the Klan, this is mostly a story about corruption. And it's certainly a story about violence. Now, what's interesting about this period is at the same time that the Republicans are, at the same time that Southern Democrats are criticizing corruption in the South by saying there are too many voters who are black voters who are ignorant and are doing, voting incorrectly. At the same time in the North, the 14th Amendment, which has declared that everybody has the right to vote, right? All men have the right to vote, and that the federal government decides this, and the states can't take away that right to vote. What also happens is that many immigrants in northern cities who had previously not been allowed to vote are allowed to vote, and this includes the Irish in New York. And so at the same time that the Republicans are being attacked for courting these poorer black voters by the Democrats in the North are being attacked for courting Irish voters and introducing corruption of their own. This is Tammany Hall. This is machine politics, and I'll talk about machine politics next week. But basically, a political machine that's in the hands of the illiterate or the people who are only after their own interests. And so what you have is both parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, attacking the other for broadening the franchise. Democrats are appealing to Irish voters and many immigrants. Republicans are appealing to black voters and many newly enfranchised. And the other party is attacking them for doing so, right? And so this is a lot of the talk that we hear about corruption in the 1860s and 1870s has a lot to do with just the fact that the franchise is broadening. New people are voting that hadn't voted before, and some people find this disturbing. The Klan attacks are crucial at ending Reconstruction and bringing about what's called redemption. Redemption is the term that, it's not Nathan Bedford Forrest, it's South Carolina. Democrats use the term redemption to describe their return to power, that they have been redeemed. And what happens is that white voters who had voted for the Republican Party immediately after the war, in 66 and 68 and 70 and even in 72, that they stop voting for the Republican Party and start to vote widely for the Democratic Party. These political attacks help break down the black-white coalition that had held the Republican Party together, however tenuously, however incompletely in the South. And Democrats return to power in southern states, and once they get a majority in those southern states, and so that's the number bracketed here. So in 1868, North Carolina is readmitted into the Union because it's passed a constitution that Congress finds acceptable. It's ratified the 13th and 14th Amendment, but by 1870, Democrats take control of the House, and they basically begin the process of preventing black voting. They begin the process of pardoning everyone who is involved in the Klan, who have been initially, some of them arrested in North Carolina and South Carolina, elsewhere. Basically mass pardons of everyone who is involved in this violence against black voters. The Klan itself becomes a very open organization. In fact, the Klan is, in a certain sense, the military wing of the Democratic Party, the Southern Democratic Party, between 1868 and 1872. And they achieve power through partly violent means. In Georgia, in South Carolina, when white Southerners come into the state house, they forcibly eject all black people from the Congress, from the state house. Arkansas and Tennessee, likewise, around the same time, between 68 and 72, in the height of the Klan, regain control. And then they can't formally disfranchise black people, right? They can't. The 14th Amendment says everybody gets a right to vote, but they scare people away from voting, which is crucial for the return of power of the Democratic Party. And bear with me here for a second. And so this is what the South becomes like after redemption. White Southerners voting and black Southerners voting, but a relatively small number. Something like 8 to 10% of black men are voting after 1872. In places that are majority black districts, like coastal South Carolina or southern Mississippi and Louisiana, black people are still voting because the Klan is not going to show their face in a majority black county, right? They will be killed if they show their face in a majority black county. It's only in places where there's a balance between Republicans and Democrats where the Klan appears. They cannot really forcibly claim power in these places at first. And so what you get is this sort of white democratic, white kind of almost primarily white people voting, a few black people voting, and the reemergence of the Solid South. And this is true. The Solid South, which votes continuously Democratic and is in continually the hands of this Democratic Party, lasts from 1868 to 1960. From 1868 to 1960, we see this a kind of one-party state emerge throughout the South, and that party is the Democratic Party. Republicans exist in a few of those districts, like South Carolina and Louisiana. They sometimes send people to the House of Representatives who are black representatives. But by and large, what we see is a solid South, the Democratic Party being the only party in the South. That only ends with the Civil Rights Act of 1960, which actually is the first legislative enforcement of the 14th Amendment, passed almost 100 years earlier. It's in this period of widespread conflict and anger at the emergence of interstate railroads and things like that, that Jesse James emerges. Let me go back for a second, though, to talk about railroads. So before the war, remember that southern states' railroads had often failed, and they had to be state-supported to succeed. And so that meant that while railroads like the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, or the Union Pacific, these northern railroads, were mostly owned by private investors, all southern railroads were owned by state governments in part. State governments owned at least half of the stock and the bonds of southern railroads. During the period of presidential Reconstruction, radical Reconstruction, and redemption, through this period, over time, these stocks and bonds are being sold by southern states to a tiny group of investors who are connected with these railroads. And that's how we get the Southern Railway that goes from Richmond to Atlanta. That's how we get the Norfolk and Western Railroad that goes from Norfolk to Louisiana. That's how we get the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad that I talked about before that goes from Richmond all the way west to the Ohio River. These consolidated railroads kind of emerge and are taken over by private capitalists. The opposition to this kind of corruption, this sort of white, this democratic language, motivates Jesse James, who claims to be a sort of white vigilante who is going to defeat the railroads of the South. He robs railroads. He robs banks that are connected with the Republican Party. He's not a Klansman. He's really just a vigilante. But there's a lot of this kind of vigilante violence that's happening throughout the South in this period too. That's not directly connected with the Klan, but it is in a way directly connected to this sort of democratic opposition to the corporate takeover of many Southern institutions, but railroads being the primary one. And so the legacy of this chaos, the legacy of this violence is going to continue in the South. As in the mountains of Virginia and North Carolina and Tennessee, we're going to see family violence and personal violence emerge in large part. We're also going to see lynching emerge in this period, as lynching is not technically what it is that the Klan does. The Klan actually, has a kind of quasi-formal execution of people. But lynching, a sort of vigilante and guerrilla violence, spreads across the South after redemption. It's connected in part with this sort of conflict that follows the Civil War. Okay, so that's what happens in the South. What happens in the South is grim and complicated. We get a stable Democratic Party called the Solid South, which is going to rule Congress, actually, from basically, we're going to have, not rule Congress, but have tremendous power in Congress from the 1870s to the 1960s. The Democratic Party, and the Southern Democratic Party in particular, it's the only party in every southern state, just about, and with a few exceptions on the coast and elsewhere. This single party system is going to mean that those Southern Democrats are going to emerge as the chairs of their committees. They're going to have, tenure in those committees over a long term. They're going to understand the purpose of those committees. Congress is going to be, in many ways, in the hands of Southern Democrats for quite a long time, in part because of the forcible ejection of black voters. It's not until the 1880s and 1890s that we see grandfather clauses and understanding clauses and all these other constitutional attempts to bar black people from voting. But black people are mostly terrified away from voting by the Klan. And it's that legacy that we see by the end of the period that we're talking about. Slavery is over, people are free, but the political power of a kind of white Southern elite is in some ways entrenched and strengthened in the South. Okay, thanks so much. And we'll talk about the other staple, which emerges in the West, and that's wheat. We'll talk about industrialization in the Midwest. We'll talk about the Gilded Age and those sorts of things in the weeks to follow. Thanks, everybody.